An accord described as the cornerstone of European security is unraveling. Russia is finally withdrawing from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe in November. NATO has condemned the move. But did the treaty ever work, and what does this mean for global arms control? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Treaties are hard fought and often take years to negotiate. They are designed to keep peace, preventing rival countries from going to war. One agreement, signed in 1990 towards the end of the Cold War, is the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. The United States, other NATO members, the former Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies agreed to prevent military buildup at their borders. But in recent years, NATO's expansion towards East and Russia's security interests have left that accord all but meaningless. Now, Moscow says it will withdraw from the treaty in November. We'll explore the implications with our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Al Jazeera's defense editor, Alex Katopoulos.
Signed in 1990, towards the end of the Cold War, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, or CFE, was designed as a confidence-building measure between NATO and what was then the Warsaw Pact. The main aim was to limit the amount of conventional weapons in Europe from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains. NATO and the Warsaw Pact were each limited to 20,000 tanks, 20,000 pieces of heavy artillery, 6,800 combat aircraft, and 2,000 attack helicopters. The number seems staggering today, but at the time it was felt with verification that this ceiling on conventional arms in Europe would prevent one side launching a sudden attack on the other. The agreement was part of a series of treaties designed to lower tensions between the two blocs in a move towards peace and relative stability. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the gradual erosion of these Cold War treaties, along with NATO's rapid expansion east, left Russia increasingly worried NATO was still being used to contain it. Even before the war in Ukraine, Poland's military was being bolstered, with the United States and other NATO members beefing up their presence both in Poland and the Baltic states. Friday's announcement by Russia that it would no longer comply with the treaty is yet another sign of the dramatic escalation in tensions between NATO and Russia. Alex Katopoulos for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Fort Liberty, North Carolina, is Peter Eltsov, Associate Professor of International Security Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. In Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense and Russian foreign policy analyst. And in Geneva is Samuel Romani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute and author of Putin's War on Ukraine. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Peter, let me start with you today. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, which is an accord that's often referred to as the cornerstone of European security, it's unraveling. So what does this mean for global arms control?
Well, it's a disaster, but it was completely expected. First of all, I would like to clarify, I don't speak on behalf of the U.S. government. I work for the government, but I speak just express my own views. And I think it's a disaster. Some of political analysts now use this theory that we're coming back to some kind of new medievalism. There is basically no treaties left. And Rheinmetall is producing arms galore. That's a famous German company. They're making tanks for Ukraine now. And their budget is increased by hundreds of billions, I believe $500 billion for the Defense Department, for the Minister of Defense in Germany. Russia has realized that this war has turned into a conventional war, like everyone was speaking about the importance of irregular or hybrid warfare. Now we have a conventional war in Europe, not seen or on the scale, not seen since World War II. So we're coming back in some sense to pre-World War I situation, when there are no rules, no regulation, no just war theory rules. The Battle of Bakhmut has been compared to the Battle of Verdun of World War I. This is pretty much an attrition war, which both sides need a lot of conventional arms. This is a very frightening situation, I would say, for the whole world.
Pavel, so Moscow says now that it will withdraw from the CFE treaty in November. Is there anything that could be done that would convince Russia to return to the treaty?
Well, the CFE is basically dead for a long time. Russia already withdrew from the treaty in December 2007 after a half a year waiting period. So now it's just formally scrapping it, but it's not been complying for a very long time. These treaties that ended the Cold War, Open Skies, CFE, others, they reflected the political reality in Europe when the Cold War was over and everyone was wanted to disarm, build confidence. And these treaties were to build confidence, to disarm, to build trust. Now there's no trust left. There's armament instead of disarmament. So the treaties cannot be salvaged because the political reality they reflected no longer exists. This is a different world, and it will require different treaties, maybe in the future, to codify and make more safe this more unsafe world of conflict inside Europe.
Samuel, you heard Pavel there say that the CFE has essentially been dead for a long time. President Putin suspended Russia's participation in the CFE treaty in 2007. In 2015, Russia announced it was halting participation in the treaty, and now we know that Russia is going to withdraw in November. Has the treaty been effective since 2007 or even 2015? Has it been dead all this time, or was there some cooperation going on at some level up until now?
Well, basically, I mean, the treaty that in CFE is actually been dying since 1999, when there was a debate about the adapted CFE treaty, and the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Kazakhstan joined that. But the Russians obviously wanted the whole of NATO approach, so all other NATO countries should be able to consider regulating their arms control and their arms arsenals in the same way. So it's been dying since 1999. Its death accelerated after 2007, and then there was an indefinite total withdrawal in March of 2015. So I don't think it's been really effective. I think that it's part of a broader problem with the arms control regime that we've seen affect New START inspections as well as the death of the INF Treaty. But these treaties remaining even partially or nominally in effect created at least an atmosphere for dialogue on arms regulation and also on nuclear proliferation more broadly. So it may have had an indirect or tangential benefit for dialogue and cooperation. I don't think it's really been an effective mechanism for a very long time.
Peter, earlier you were talking about the dissolution of this treaty in very stark terms, talking about very, very dire consequences going forward. I want to ask you from your vantage point, did the CFE treaty ever really work? And why should people have cared or not cared that it was or wasn't working?
Well, I agree with the previous speaker, in fact, that it had some symbolic significance, that people were talking to each other. I'm sure sides were not exactly following this treaties and violating them very often, and particularly in recent years. But like with the nuclear START treaty, which was also abandoned in February by Russia, there was some framework for discussion. There is no framework for discussion and conversation at all now. Basically, the hands are completely open for this proliferation, nuclear proliferation, and regular conventional arms. So even though it may have not worked in the past really well, there was some kind of a system in place. Now there is nothing left, pretty much.
Pavel, obviously we can't have this conversation without talking about the war in Ukraine. From your vantage point, how much did the war in Ukraine factor into Russia's decision to fully withdraw from the treaty?
Well, the Russian foreign policy began changing in 2007, actually. Dramatically, there was this famous Putin's address to the Munich Security Conference. Russia turned from kind of cooperation with the West to confrontation, if not directly, but rather slowly and solidly. And the treaties that were built on cooperation became increasingly irrelevant. CFE was a rather effective treaty. When it was signed, tens of thousands of tanks and other heavy Soviet equipment were moved out of Europe into the Far East and in Central Asia and into Siberia. And also, that even when the Cold War ended and the quotas of the CFE were no longer much relevant, it's a very intrusive on-site inspection regime was the main feature, especially for smaller European nations that didn't have the capabilities of the United States to gather raw intel. So this maybe was the main reason why Russia actually moved out of the treaty, to prevent the on-site inspections. There's, of course, the Vienna Protocol still there, but that's not as intrusive and effective. So this treaty, as the conflict was being brewing, first with Georgia, then Crimea, then Ukraine, treaties and on-site inspections became something that the Russian military didn't want to see, because on-site allows to see actual battle readiness of units. It's hard to pick that up through satellite ways. So other treaties also disappeared, like the open skies, because Russia wanted it, Europe wanted it, but America didn't, and the treaty is also dead. I mean, there is no political backbone for a treaty. A treaty in itself cannot stand anymore.
All right, Pavel was mentioning some other treaties that have disintegrated over the years. I want to step back for a moment and take a look at some of the other agreements that were meant to strengthen Europe's security but are no longer effective. The Open Skies Treaty permits unarmed reconnaissance flights over member states' territory to collect data on military forces and activities. It was signed in 1992 and came into force 10 years later. But the U.S. withdrew in 2020, accusing Russia of repeated violations. Russia pulled out the following year. Then there's the 2011 Vienna document, an international agreement on military transparency. In 2022, Russia refused to share data with the other 56 members. Now, Samuel, let me go to you. This gradual undoing of a group of interlocked agreements and arms-controlled treaties, does that mean that the existing security architecture in Europe is no longer strong enough to ensure peace on the continent?
Well, I think it definitely is true that that's the case. I mean, the existing European security architecture has been dismantled one by one, mostly because of Russian unilateralism and Russian obstructionism. The Russians, of course, would often claim that the West was trying to tie arms control to other political issues. For example, one of the reasons why they claimed that NATO did not ratify the adapted CFE treaty was because Russia was maintaining a peacekeeping contingent in Transnistria and also forces in Georgia, as well as committing atrocities in Chechnya that were unrelated to arms control. So the Russians will accuse the West of basically tying that arms control to many other geopolitical conflicts and making the arms control regime more diluted. But Russian obstructionism has definitely played a part in the collapse of the European security order, particularly when the Americans tried to reach out to the Russians to have talks in Cairo. The Russians postponed that, nothing happened. It's really, really a bad situation.
Peter, let's talk about the knock-on effect of all this. I mean, when the rest of the world sees that these treaties are unraveling, what does it mean for global security going forward?
Well, as I've already said, it's a pretty disastrous situation. There are basically many centers in the world now. The Pentagon used to have this formula 4+1. That was China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, plus non-state actors. Now it's really the geopolitical situation. There are new rising centers of power like Turkey, India, Pakistan, Brazil. So basically, the world is characterized by this tremendous disbalance of power. This is the most critical situation, I would argue, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so basically, these centers of power can act on their own militarily, politically, and of course, in terms of production of arms and local conflicts. We can see that Turkey and Russia, now Turkey in theory, I say emphasize in theory, is a NATO member, but it's pretty much dealing in a very friendly manner with Russia dividing territories and spheres of influence, for example, in Syria. So, and many rogue actors now will be able to produce arms, deal on their own, like the Wagner Group is operating in Mali and Central African Republic. So basically, there are no rules anymore left and no security agreements. Then there is a global South, which is quite sympathetic or at least neutral towards Russia on the war in Ukraine. There is some information that a country like South Africa may be helping militarily to Russia in the conflict. So, I mean, this is a very, very grim situation, I would say.
Pavel, we spoke a moment ago about the Open Skies Treaty. That was one example that we gave when going through the history of some of these treaties that have come apart. When the U.S. withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty, how was that perceived? How much did that decision ratchet up the level of mistrust that we're now witnessing between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, it did it not only between the U.S. and Russia, between the U.S. and Europe, because Europe very much wanted to have open skies. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars into keeping it alive. Germany was building a new plane certified for open skies. Sweden had a new plane. Russia invested hundreds of millions of those dollars to build two Tupolev planes certified for the treaty. And the United States said, no, that's it, and we're going out, because Congress didn't want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars of building new planes. And the old American planes were Boeing 707s built in the beginning of the 60s, and they have been since scrapped after the U.S. left the treaty. And building new ones, we get intel that the American Pentagon didn't need, because Open Skies used equipment that provided not very accurate kind of images. So, but that was important for European countries and for Russia, which didn't have the American recon capability that's most likely the best in the world. So America was not interested. The treaty went. Russia is not interested in CFE. The treaty goes. Self-interest of different countries rules right now. The others will have to just simply do what they can when the other parties decide not to follow the rules, because the rules do not right now reconcile with the political reality in Europe and the world.
Samuel, it looked to me like you were reacting to some of what Pavel was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, basically, I wasn't really particularly reacting to that, but obviously, I think one of the other points I wanted to bring up is that this is not just an issue regarding NATO and Russia regulating arms control. The United States has been trying to basically loop China into the global arms control regime, and China has steadfastly resisted that. One of the efforts that Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, many other senior officials in the Trump administration wanted to do was actually have a renegotiation of New START, which would regulate the Chinese nuclear arsenal in the same way as the Russians and the Americans. And the Russians have usually sided with Beijing on that and pointed the finger at British, French, and NATO nuclear arsenals as well. And finally, there's also a clash between Russia and many of the European security institutions that it still remains a member of. Russia is out of the Council of Europe, but it's still part of the OSCE. But Russia has been clashing with the OSCE repeatedly and undermining its credibility, accusing some of their operatives of espionage in the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, harassing them to the point at which they have to withdraw. So this is a broader symptom and a broader problem that extends well beyond just arms control to other factors like I just mentioned.
Peter, I saw you nodding along to some of what Samuel was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
Yes, I agree pretty much with the sentiment that there is so much distrust right now that I don't see basically like any opportunity for any new treaties. And what Samuel was saying about the START, the new START, that was very true. That was a sentiment on the side of the Trump administration that China kind of was left outside of that, and that needed to be renegotiated. Now we have India and Pakistan, the countries which have nuclear weapons too. So basically, the hands are really open for all the players to do pretty much whatever they want. But that political distrust has never happened since even the Cold War, because even in the Cold War, there was, first of all, there were pretty much two centers of power, Moscow and Washington. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a kind of a mutual respect and understanding where the red lines were. Now there are no red lines. And in terms of conventional arms, this is a really a conventional war on the scale of World War I or World War II going on in Europe right now. So, I mean, again, I'm sorry I sound so pessimistic, but this is a very grim situation. Fiona Hill, actually Trump's senior advisor on Eurasia, and a very, I would say, sane person just recently said that we are in the beginning of World War III. And I mean, this is not an optimistic situation with the abandoning of basically all the treaties right now.
Pavel, Peter was talking about the Cold War. I want to go back a ways and ask you something. You know, from the American point of view, negotiations over the CFE treaty were seen as successful. But I want to ask you about what it was like from the Soviet perspective. Was there a sense that Gorbachev had given away too much ground to NATO from the get-go?
Well, yes. I mean, most likely Gorbachev even didn't know in particular how much weapons the Russian military, Soviet military, have stashed for the big war in Europe. And so when the treaty was signed, it turned out that we had to very quickly move enormous amounts of hardware away behind the Urals and Central Asia into the Far East and dump it there in the middle of deserts or taiga in Siberia. So yes, there was the Russian military were taken a bit by surprise, the Soviet military, by the terms that turned out when they didn't even tell, most likely, the Kremlin how many tanks they had, and they had about 100,000. Not all, of course, in Europe, but in all. And most of them were in the European part of Russia and in Eastern Europe. So that was also, of course, always a problem because communications between the Kremlin and the military, the Russian military, are always, well, a bit of a problem. The Kremlin not always knows what their own military have and are capable for, and makes political mistakes, like with going into Ukraine and with a military that turned out to be not very good for the job. But the war in Ukraine is going to end. Wars end. There's going to be some kind of peace established, and new treaties will have to appear to keep the situation under wraps. A war that no one needs in Europe, apparently now. No one really is ready for it. And so that means, I believe, that the new architecture of security and conventional weapons in Europe will appear after the Ukrainian conflict is resolved.
Samuel, I want to dig in a little bit more into the history and the development of the CFE treaty over the years. There was an updated CFE treaty that was drafted and approved in Istanbul in 1999. That took into account new realities such as the Warsaw Pact dissolution as well as NATO expansion. But because NATO countries didn't ratify that agreement, President Putin suspended Russia's participation in the CFE treaty in 2007. Then you have 2015, Putin essentially suspending their participation in it. If NATO countries hadn't ratified the agreement, why would NATO expect Russia to adhere to its obligations?
Well, that's basically what the Russian argument is that the NATO countries were tying the regulation of the arms control regime to other aspects of Russian conduct. There were also a couple of other follow-ups that happened afterward, too. There was the CFE 1A, which limited the American forces to 250,000 troops. That worked and that held. Obviously, there was a parallel and a close timing, obviously, between 2007 with this withdrawal and the Munich speech, which Vladimir Putin unveiled his anti-Western messaging, and then the 2008 presidential elections, which saw Putin be replaced by Dmitry Medvedev. So I think that Russian domestic politics probably played a role in shaping some of its critiques of the Western handling of CFE at that time. But the Russians did point to double standards with regards to 1999. And also, there's a tangential issue, but the violations of the CFE by some smaller states, in particular Azerbaijan, have been noted, and that really hasn't been done, much has been done to slap them on the wrist either.
Pavel, treaties like the ones we're discussing, how hard are they to put together? How hard fought are they, and how much effort does it take?
Well, the conventional negotiations on conventional forces in Europe that formed the CFE began a long time before. They lasted all the 80s. There was talks, and they got nowhere at all during the Cold War. But when the political atmosphere changed with Gorbachev ending the Cold War together with Reagan, the technicalities that were achieved during these Geneva unsuccessful talks on conventional forces allowed the CFE to be very swiftly put together. So when the political atmosphere changes, there's capabilities, and if there are negotiations going on even on a technical level, that allows for swift movement forward when a political atmosphere is good for that.
And Pavel, we only have 1 minute left. Let me just ask you very quickly, do you expect, given the geopolitical moment that we are in right now, so many crises playing out concurrently, do you expect that we're going to just be seeing more treaties unravel going forward?
Well, there's not that many left already. So, yes, I mean, right now we're in a confrontational mode. But again, this war will end, and confrontation, the sides, NATO and Russia, will have to find some kind of quid pro quo, some kind of modus vivendi moving forward. That's inevitable.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave our conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Peter Eltsov, Pavel Felgenhauer, and Samuel Romani. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.